On the morning of March 14th, 1857, the Richmond Exchange prepared for another day of business in the city that prided itself as the commercial heart of Virginia. Yet, nothing about that day would resemble an ordinary auction. Beneath the tall, cold columns of the Exchange's portico, where countless human lives had been priced and sold, something stepped onto the auction block that left the city shaken for decades. What happened there became a scar in Richmond's collective memory, one that citizens whispered about long after the Civil War had ended and the Exchange itself had vanished from Franklin Street. To understand the magnitude of what occurred, one must first picture Richmond in those final years before the war. The city stood proudly upon the banks of the James River, its tobacco warehouses rising like fortresses of wealth. Church bells from a dozen steeples marked each hour across a population of nearly 40,000 people, merchants on Church Hill, laborers crowded in Shockoe Bottom, and the enslaved who outnumbered their owners but remained invisible in nearly all civic records. Richmond's prosperity came from commerce, and central to that commerce were the auction houses where more than 12,000 enslaved people were sold every year. At the center of this world operated Thomas Fairmont, a seasoned auctioneer whose reputation rested on precision, discipline, and his uncanny ability to maximize profit. He kept meticulous ledgers, describing each person he sold with the cold efficiency expected by the market's gills, scars, temperament, even warnings like defiant eyes, or reads scripture, dangerous. His voice had echoed through the Exchange for 2 decades, guiding the bidding with practiced rhythm and an air of absolute authority. That morning began as predictably as any other. The first lots came from a bankrupt plantation in Goochland County. 10 individuals sold at unremarkable prices to familiar buyers, but at exactly 11:47 a.m., Fairmont paused. The side door opened and 3 people entered. 2 men with mud on their boots and travel-worn coats, and between them, a woman whose presence silenced the entire exchange. She was of average height, yet her posture was unnervingly straight despite the iron shackles binding her wrists. Her skin carried the deep tan of outdoor labor, but her hands lacked the calluses and scars typical of field work. Her cotton dress was plain but immaculately clean. Her hair was pulled tightly back, revealing a face of absolute stillness. No tremor, no fear, no plea for mercy. Her age seemed impossible to guess, somewhere near 30, but it was her eyes that unsettled the crowd. They did not reflect terror, resignation, or anger. Instead, they carried a quiet, unreadable intelligence, as if she was observing rather than being observed. Fairmont's composure faltered for the first time in his long career. He spoke briefly with the escorts, reviewing documents they carried in cracked leather cases. Witnesses reported that the color drained from his face, returned, and drained again as he read. When he approached the platform, the confidence that usually strengthened his voice had thinned into something unfamiliar. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we have before us an unusual lot." The seller, he explained, had chosen anonymity, a legal right though rarely invoked. The woman had no listed name, no recorded history, no stated origin. She was simply Lot 37, age estimated around 30, with no documented labor or household service. This alone was strange, but stranger still was the opening bid. $5,000, Fairmont declared. Silence followed, a hard, stunned silence. $5,000 was a price reserved for a prime breeding pair or highly skilled craftsman. To place such a value on a single unnamed woman with no recorded abilities was irrational to the point of absurdity. The crowd muttered. Someone shouted that Fairmont had lost his senses, but the auctioneer did not budge. Instead, he opened the leather folder and began to read a sworn attestation, an action so rare that many buyers had never seen it done. According to the document, the woman possessed knowledge of significant value to parties concerned with agriculture, commerce, and territorial development, verified by 3 independent witnesses. The buyer would also receive a sealed letter containing instructions for extracting said knowledge. with a guarantee that attempts to force answers would fail. This was not the language of a sale. It was the language of a warning. Confusion rippled into anger, but before the crowd could regain its footing, a voice from the backs, steady and quiet, offered the opening bid, then another, then another. Within minutes, bidding escalated with a frenzy that defied logic. 7,000, 10,000, 15,000. Men who had come to purchase field labor found themselves wagering fortunes on something they could not fully articulate. Through it all, the woman remained motionless, her eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the crowd. The final bid, $20,000, came from a stranger no one recognized, a man with a wide, brimmed hat who spoke with calm certainty. When the auction ended, he accepted the sealed letter, removed her shackles, and led her out the same door through which she had arrived. She did not look back. She was never seen in Richmond again. The aftermath of that extraordinary sale moved through Richmond like a whispered contagion, picking up speculation and fear with every retelling, until the city's social circles could speak of little else for weeks. Men who had witnessed the bidding swore that something unnatural had hung in the air that morning, a pressure they could not name, as though the exchange had become the stage for a performance none of them understood. Even the 3 men who collapsed during the auction became objects of morbid fascination. 2 of them recovered with shaky explanations about the heat or lack of breakfast, while the third was never seen in Richmond again, fueling rumors that stretched beyond reason. But while the city gossiped, the most unsettling activity took place quietly inside the exchange itself. When clerks attempted to examine Fairmont's ledger entry for that day, they discovered that 7 consecutive pages had been sliced cleanly from the book, leaving behind only faint impressions of ink bleeding from the reverse side, ghostly traces of whatever Fairmont had written in those missing records. The removal was surgical, deliberate, and performed by someone who knew exactly what needed to vanish. Fairmont refused to answer questions, claiming illness and closing the exchange for days before reopening with a cold, mechanical silence. Not even his closest colleagues could pry a sentence from him about the woman who had been sold for $20,000. Yet the absence of answers only intensified the city's hunger for understanding, and soon the rumors became more fantastical with each exchange. Some claimed she possessed secret knowledge of lost Confederate gold, an impossibility, given that the Confederacy did not yet exist. Others insisted she could recite passages from forgotten land surveys, that she carried maps in her mind that had been burned or hidden by families with something to lose. A tavern keeper near Shockoe Bottom swore she had spoken a language unlike anything he had heard in his life, though it was unclear how he would have been close enough to hear her at all, considering she said almost nothing during the auction. But the rumor that gained the widest traction, the one repeated in quiet conversations by men who prided themselves on knowing things, centered on the sealed letter handed to the mysterious buyer. According to this version, the instructions required the woman to be placed in complete darkness, asked questions in a precise order, and kept in isolation for hours until she chose to speak. Only then, under those exact conditions, would she reveal what she knew. The idea that her knowledge could be extracted like a mineral from rock appealed to the imaginations of speculators and landowners who saw opportunity where others saw danger. Yet even those who repeated the stories admitted they felt uneasy describing them, as though they were reciting something meant to be forgotten. The rumors grew stranger still when people began discussing the buyer himself. Investigators who attempted to trace him discovered that the bank draft he used for payment came from an account belonging to a livestock company in Staunton, a company that, as far as anyone could tell, had ceased to exist 7 years prior, leaving behind nothing but an empty warehouse. The listed magistrate who supposedly verified the seller's statement could not be found anywhere in Albemarle County, despite the seal being genuine. The 3 witnesses mentioned in the attestation were never identified. It was as if the entire transaction had been engineered by shadows. And still, The most chilling detail came 3 days after the auction, when inquiries about the buyer's identity began circulating. Those who followed the thread discovered that the man had traveled northwest into the Blue Ridge Mountains, taking the woman with him to a region that even seasoned Richmonders considered remote and unknowable. The idea that such a valuable property could disappear into the wilderness unsettled many buyers who believed every enslaved person in Virginia could be tracked, assessed, and reclaimed. But the trail ended abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed them both. More questions surfaced than answers. Why had the buyer wanted her so desperately? What knowledge could command a price exceeding that of entire plantations? And why had the seller destroyed so much of the paper trail? As these mysteries circulated, a quiet unease settled over Richmond. Men who prided themselves on logic and commerce found themselves whispering about omens. Clerks avoided the exchange's basement where the ledgers were kept. Even Fairmont, once the embodiment of certainty, moved like a man carrying an invisible weight he could not put down. The truth was simple. No one knew what they had witnessed that March morning. But everyone sensed they had seen something they were not meant to understand, something that stretched beyond the comfortable boundaries of commerce and into a realm where knowledge itself was dangerous, valuable, and impossible to contain. In the weeks that followed the mysterious sale, Richmond slowly returned to its routines, at least outwardly, but beneath the surface, the story clung to people's minds like a persistent shadow. It was during that time that a young journalist named Charles Whitfield of the Richmond Dispatch became fascinated with the strange event. Whitfield had a reputation for curiosity that bordered on obsessive persistence. He had once uncovered a municipal embezzlement scheme simply because a clerk's handwriting seemed too hurried in one ledger entry. So when he heard about a woman sold for $20,000, an amount more fitting for a plantation than a single person, he felt pulled toward the mystery with an instinct he could not ignore. He began his investigation at the Albemarle County Courthouse, seeking the magistrate whose seal had supposedly authenticated the seller's statement. But what he found only deepened the strangeness. While the seal impression existed in the official books, the document itself had been filed in a restricted section inaccessible to the public, and the clerk who guarded those records responded to Whitfield's polite questions with an icy refusal, warning him not to mingle in matters that carry consequences. Unsettled but undeterred, Whitfield traveled to Staunton, hoping to find the Lavestock Company whose bank draft had purchased Lot 37. The address led him to a boarded-up warehouse abandoned for 7 years, though the chain on the door bore fresh scratches, as if someone had accessed the building recently. When he questioned nearby business owners, he received conflicting accounts. One man was certain the property belonged to a land speculator from Lexington. Another swore it belonged to a mining operation from the western mountains, while a third simply turned away, refusing to speak the moment warehouse was mentioned. Whitfield sensed he was brushing against something carefully concealed, something that had nothing to do with livestock or ordinary trade. His suspicions were confirmed several months later, when an anonymous letter arrived at the dispatch offices, postmarked from Waynesboro. The letter contained only 3 unsettling sentences written in elegant handwriting. The knowledge she carries could redraw maps. Some borders exist only in men's minds. Stop searching before you learn which category you occupy. Whitfield published a cautious article summarizing the unusual sale, leaving out the more alarming implications. The piece appeared modestly in the August 3rd edition, tucked between advertisements and notices, and drew mild public curiosity, but no substantial outcry. Then, 3 days later, Whitfield vanished. He simply failed to arrive at the dispatch office one morning. His boarding house room was untouched, clothes neatly folded, possessions orderly, bed made, money still in its drawer. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses reporting suspicious activity. The police investigation concluded nothing, His bank account remained unused, and no one in the city recalled seeing him leave. It was as if he had stepped out of Richmond and dissolved into the thin summer air. His disappearance became the most disturbing addition to the growing web of oddities surrounding Lot 37, strengthening the belief that whatever knowledge the woman possessed was valuable enough that someone was willing to erase anyone who came too close to it. As years passed, the city endured war and reconstruction, and Richmond transformed from a bustling commercial hub into a battered Confederate capital struggling to rebuild. Buildings burned, businesses vanished, and countless records were lost or scattered. The Exchange building itself became a military depot, then later abandoned, its floors collecting dust as the memories of auctions faded into a past many wished to forget. When Thomas Fairmont died in 1869, his nephew inherited his belongings and discovered a locked iron box among them. A box Fairmont's will instructed must be thrown into the James River unopened. The nephew complied, though he later admitted the box had been heavier than expected, as though filled with lead plates or documents whose weight carried meaning beyond their physical mass. Even as the decades stretched on, the story of the strange sale refused to die. In 1873, a retired Confederate officer named Daniel Vaughan published a memoir recounting his war years. The book was largely ignored, yet tucked within its pages was a haunting claim. During a winter in Richmond Hospital, Vaughan overheard two old men discussing the sale, and one said the buyer had not stumbled upon the woman by chance. According to the conversation, he had spent 3 years searching for someone with her particular abilities, traveling from Baltimore to Charleston before finally finding her and paying whatever price the seller demanded. Some secrets, the man said, are worth more than gold because they reveal where the gold is buried. This suggestion, that the buyer knew precisely what he was acquiring, reignited interest among a small number of scholars and curious individuals who later encountered Vaughan's obscure memoir. Yet despite speculation, no one could determine what knowledge justified such desperation, such secrecy, or such a fearsome price. Richmond, already a city accustomed to ghosts, gained yet another legend. A woman whose silence held something powerful enough to shape fortunes, ruin men, or disappear those who looked too closely. And through all the fragments of rumor and half-remembered stories, one truth endured: whatever happened on that March morning had not ended with the sale. It had merely begun a chain of events that would ripple through decades of history, pulling in anyone who dared to seek its answers. The mystery surrounding the woman's disappearance might have faded into folklore if not for a determined historian named Margaret Holloway, who in 1891 stumbled upon a small reference to the Richmond Exchange sale while researching antebellum commerce for an academic article. Holloway was known for her meticulous nature and her refusal to accept superficial explanations, and the mention of a $20,000 purchase of an unnamed woman struck her immediately as an anomaly too significant to ignore. Convinced that extraordinary prices always signaled extraordinary circumstances, she began searching old courthouse records in Richmond, eventually finding the exchange ledgers stored in a neglected basement where moisture had stained their edges and dust clung to the bindings. When she opened the volume containing the 1,857 entries, the first thing she noticed was the gap where 7 pages had been surgically removed. The impressions bleeding faintly through the reverse side revealed fragments of words, terms like ridgeline, survey marks, seam, and depth phrases that did not belong in the description of any enslaved person sold on an auction floor. Intrigued and unsettled, Holloway spent days in that dim storage room, angling the pages toward lantern light, tracing each partial word with growing certainty that whatever had been written on those missing pages related not to a human biography, but to a geological record. This revelation pushed her to widen her investigation to Augusta County, where the buyer's supposed livestock company had been based. By then, the original warehouse was gone, replaced by a hardware store whose owner had no knowledge of its history. But Holloway dug deeper by examining the chain of property transfers. The building had changed hands frequently between 1857 and 1885, each owner listed with an address in a different Virginia county, and the irregularity of those transactions suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than ordinary business activity. Every lead she followed dissolved into half-truths or vanished records, yet the pattern itself, the rapid turnover, the scattered owners, the vague business descriptions, revealed a coordinated effort to bury the identity of whoever had controlled that company at the time of the sale. This secrecy only fueled Holloway's determination. She moved next to Albemarle County, scouring tax records, land deeds, and survey reports. During this search, she discovered something that finally connected the puzzle to solid ground. In April 1857, just 1 month after the Richmond sale, a tract of land 240 acres near Swift Run Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains was purchased by a buyer listed as J. Marlowe, agent, for the substantial price of $12,000. Most mountain land in that region was considered unsuitable for serious cultivation, so such a large payment immediately suggested the buyer was interested in something beneath the soil rather than above it. Even more compelling was the property description, which referenced granite outcrops, limestone formations, and coal seam exposures. Details far more precise than typical land boundaries referencing trees or creek bends. Holloway realized she was not looking at ordinary property, but at something identified for its geological potential. That discovery led her deeper into the mountains in December 1891, where she hired a local guide named Samuel Fletcher. Fletcher brought her up a narrow track to the abandoned property, revealing a clearing overtaken by forest but still bearing traces of what once existed. A collapsed cabin, a sealed well shaft, and numerous depressions scattered throughout the land, old excavation sites silent and forgotten. Holloway counted 14 separate dig locations, many spaced in a pattern that seemed intentional. When she plotted their positions on a sketch, she realized they formed an alignment that likely traced the path of an underground mineral seam. Fletcher then told her stories passed down from his father, who had worked briefly for the land's mysterious owner. According to him, the man, whom he knew only as Marlowe, had hired laborers to dig at dozens of spots, always under the direction of the woman he brought with him. She would stand quietly, observing the ridge, the slope, the way water flowed, then point to a specific patch of earth and tell them what lay beneath. Coal of good quality, iron ore, limestone, underground springs. She had predicted each one with eerie precision. Fletcher's father said the workers quickly learned not to question her, because she was never wrong. This revelation struck Holloway with the weight of truth. The woman sold in Richmond had not been valued for labor, beauty, or docility, but for a kind of knowledge few trained geologists possessed. As she and Fletcher walked through the cold mountain air, Holloway realized she was standing on the physical evidence of that knowledge. Dozens of sites where the earth had been opened because of a woman who should never, under the laws of her time, have had access to geological expertise. The cabin ruins, the sealed well shaft, the abandoned pits, all whispered of a strange partnership between the buyer and the enslaved woman he acquired. Fletcher added one final detail before Holloway's departure. His father had seen a woman matching her description in Charlottesville in 1860, boarding a northbound train and dressed in clothing far too fine for someone of her legal status. She had not lowered her eyes like most enslaved people traveling alone. Instead, she had turned and looked directly at him, with a faint smile that haunted him for the rest of his life. That small, chilling moment, one woman's silent acknowledgement, left Holloway with the sense that the story of the sale, the buyer, and the mountain work was only the beginning of a far deeper mystery. And though she did not yet know it, her investigation was steering her toward discoveries that would challenge everything she believed about knowledge, power, and the invisible lives that shaped American history. Holloway returned to Richmond with a notebook full of strange clues and a mind unsettled by the implications of what she had seen in the mountains, and as the winter deepened into the early months of 1892, she pursued the next logical thread: how an enslaved woman in antebellum Virginia could have acquired geological knowledge sophisticated enough to outmatch professional surveyors. Education for enslaved individuals had been outlawed. Scientific instruction was reserved for wealthy white men, and even exposure to technical materials was tightly controlled. Yet the evidence from Swift Run Gap suggested expertise far beyond guesswork or intuition. Determined to uncover the foundation of this impossible skill, Holloway turned her attention to the records of the Virginia Geological Survey from the 1840s and early 1850s. After weeks spent combing through dusty volumes in the Virginia State Library, she found what she had been hoping for: field journals from an 1847 expedition led by William Barton Rogers, a respected geologist who would later found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In his meticulous notes, one entry stood out with startling clarity. Rogers wrote that his expedition had been greatly aided by the addition of a Negro woman, property of Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove, who demonstrated remarkable facility for geological observation. He described her as possessing a visual memory so precise that she could identify rock formations across distant sites. And though she was believed illiterate, she interpreted the landscape with an intuitive logic none of his trained assistants could match. Rogers noted that she accelerated the mapping process significantly, and while he attempted to purchase her freedom in order to give her formal training, Hargrove reacted with fury and removed her from the expedition immediately. This account stunned Holloway, for it linked the unnamed woman from the Richmond sale with a documented scientific contribution nearly a decade earlier. Encouraged by this discovery, she pushed deeper into archival collections and uncovered two more references: a brief mention of the Hargrove woman in an 1848 survey, and a letter from a geologist in 1849 requesting permission to hire an enslaved woman with proven geological aptitude. Though the records lacked names, the pattern was unmissable. This woman had worked with multiple survey teams, had demonstrated consistent accuracy, and had acquired a rare combination of field knowledge and observational skill. But as Holloway connected these threads, a darker question arose: who inherited the woman after Colonel Hargrove's death in 1853? And how did her value transform from a helpful survey assistant to a commodity worth $20,000? Her research into Hargrove's estate revealed that the colonel had owned 18 enslaved individuals whose names were not recorded, only ages and vague descriptions. The absence of identifying details frustrated Holloway, but she refused to be deterred. She began investigating individuals known to have profited from geological discoveries in the 1850s, particularly speculators who acquired mineral-rich land in Western Virginia around the same period. Her inquiries met unusual resistance. Requests for bank records from Staunton for 1857 were denied with unconvincing explanations, and attempts to access certain property tax records were thwarted by claims that the documents had been destroyed in a courthouse fire, though no other records from that time bore fire damage. Holloway found herself pushing against invisible hands determined to keep the truth submerged. Matters grew even stranger when she received an anonymous letter from Baltimore containing only a few chilling lines. "You seek the woman from the exchange. I can tell you her name, but knowledge carries a price. Discontinue your investigation, and I will reveal what you wish to know. Continue, and you will learn why some secrets remain buried even after the war." There was no signature, no return address, no instructions for response. It was a warning and a threat wrapped in the same breath. Most researchers would have reconsidered their pursuit at this point, but Holloway was neither timid nor impressionable. Instead of retreating, she intensified her investigation, focusing now on uncovering the true identity of the buyer known as Marlowe. She discovered that the $12,000 land purchase near Swift Run Gap had required a legitimate transaction, yet every attempt to trace the funds or the name behind the purchase led to vanished records, contradictory testimonies, or bureaucratic stonewalls. Every document she sought seemed to be missing, misfiled, or locked away behind official restrictions. It became clear that someone with considerable influence, someone whose interests stretched beyond mere curiosity, did not want the story resurfacing. Months of frustration finally gave way to revelation in April 1892, when a frail elderly man named Robert Dunmore visited Holloway unexpectedly. He claimed to have known the woman before the 1857 sale, and insisted that he had employed her as a geological assistant in 1856, while working as a mining engineer. Dunmore's voice shook as he recounted how she could read a landscape like a printed page, predicting depths, seams, and mineral types with unnerving accuracy. His account matched everything Holloway had deduced, yet carried new insight. Multiple mining companies had attempted to hire the woman permanently once her talent became known, but her owner refused their offers, withdrawing her from public view. Dunmore also revealed the truth behind the buyer's identity. Marlowe was a false name used by James Pritchard, a northern land speculator who had spent 3 years searching for someone with her abilities. Pritchard knew exactly what he was buying when he paid $20,000, geological knowledge capable of building or collapsing fortunes. Most chilling of all, Dunmore recalled the only sentence the woman spoke after the sale as she left the exchange. She looked back at the crowd and said, "You have purchased knowledge, but knowledge requires payment beyond gold." Her meaning, Dunmore confessed, had haunted him for decades, and Holloway realized she had crossed into a deeper mystery, one in which knowledge was both a gift and a weapon, and the woman at its center had wielded it with a clarity no one of her time could understand. The revelations Holloway gathered from Dunmore marked a turning point in her investigation, for they transformed a collection of scattered clues into the outline of a life that had been hidden in the shadows of history. And as she pieced together the fragments, she understood that the woman once known only as Lot 37 had shaped far more of the American landscape than anyone had ever realized. Dunmore's testimony confirmed not only the woman's geological precision, but her uncanny consistency. She was never wrong, whether predicting the depth of a coal seam or the path of an iron vein, and this reliability had drawn James Pritchard into his years-long search. But Dunmore's accounts also made Holloway aware of something deeper, a thread running through every interview, archive, and rumor she had chased. The woman had never freely revealed the full extent of her knowledge to anyone. Pritchard, the survey teams, the plantation owners, even the buyers in Richmond had only glimpsed the surface of what she carried in her mind. This realization raised a disturbing possibility that the woman had knowingly controlled what she offered, choosing when and how to reveal her abilities, aware that each revelation increased both her value and her danger. Persistent but cautious, Holloway continued investigating Pritchard himself, hoping to understand the kind of man who would spend a vast fortune on a single enslaved woman, only to vanish with her into the mountains. She learned that Pritchard had begun as a minor speculator in Pennsylvania, almost irrelevant in the competitive world of mineral acquisitions. Yet within a few short years after 1857, he began quietly purchasing mineral rights across Virginia, Maryland, and parts of Tennessee. These acquisitions, though small individually, formed a pattern when viewed collectively. a network of land parcels aligned with known coal belts and iron deposits, suggesting that Pritchard was placing his money exactly where geological wealth lay buried. While other speculators gambled on rumors, Pritchard purchased with unnerving precision, as if guided by a map far more accurate than anything officially surveyed. Holloway suspected she knew the source of that map, though she lacked proof. What intrigued her further was the secrecy surrounding Pritchard's transactions. Unlike other speculators, he rarely appeared in person, worked under false names, and used intermediaries who never met one another. His financial footprint was shallow, almost intentionally blurred, and this invisibility mirrored the secrecy surrounding the woman herself. Pritchard's behavior suggested not greed but fear, fear of rivals, fear of being discovered, perhaps even fear of the knowledge he had acquired along with his purchase. Holloway wondered whether Pritchard had realized, too late, that the woman's value came with a cost he had not anticipated. This question lingered as she continued piecing through his trail, pushing through years of missing documents, contradictory accounts, and records erased by war. The next breakthrough arrived unexpectedly when Holloway examined property transfer records from Pennsylvania coal country, where she discovered references to a consultant hired during the early 1860s, someone described only as the Mountain Woman, whose predictions regarding sulfur contamination and inaccessible seams had saved companies from ruin. That description matched the mysterious accuracy attributed to the woman from the Richmond sale. But what made the discovery remarkable was the contradictory nature of the reports. Some described her as a white widow from Virginia, others as a free woman of color, others still as a foreign-born specialist. It was clear that whoever she was, she concealed her identity skillfully, adapting her appearance, clothing, and manner depending on who employed her. This ability to shift through identities suggested intelligence far beyond technical expertise, revealing a strategic mind operating with careful intent. The more Holloway learned, the more she understood that the woman had transformed from property into a ghost, moving across states, advising companies, shaping fortunes, yet always slipping away before anyone could learn her real name. But the most astonishing revelation came when Holloway uncovered documentary evidence that multiple mining firms collapsed between 1865 and 1872, all connected indirectly to Pritchard. Records showed that these firms had relied on survey data obtained during Pritchard's earlier land acquisitions, yet the geological information they used turned out disastrously wrong: seams that were too thin, ore deposits too deep, or coal contaminated beyond commercial use. And then Holloway found something even more striking. The companies that profited from these failures were the same ones rumored to have hired an unnamed consultant, who provided superior geological predictions at a lower price. Piece by piece, a chilling picture formed. The woman had not simply worked for mining companies after gaining relative freedom. She had systematically undermined the wealth of the men who had profited from her enslaved labor. She had guided them toward ruin with the same precision she once used to guide them to riches. Her knowledge had become a blade, and she had wielded it with a surgeon's hand. Even Pritchard himself was not spared. After years of success, he invested his entire fortune into a massive coal property based on geological predictions attributed to a trusted consultant. The seam existed, as she said, but the sulfur levels rendered the coal nearly worthless. Pritchard lost everything. He died in poverty, his empire collapsed, his name forgotten. For Holloway, this pattern revealed a truth that felt both shocking and inevitable. The woman had spent her life being used for her knowledge, exploited by men who considered her value only in terms of profit. Yet once she had the freedom to move, she turned that same knowledge into a quiet form of justice, not through violence or rebellion, but through the slow, deliberate destruction of the fortunes built upon her suffering. Holloway realized she was no longer studying a mystery of commerce. She was tracing the legacy of a woman who had reclaimed her power with brilliance and patience, shaping the fate of others from behind a veil of anonymity. As Holloway pushed deeper into the woman's post-war life, she encountered a A new thread of evidence that forced her to reconsider everything she thought she understood, for the final pieces of the story emerged not from mining records or courthouse archives, but from a privately printed memoir written by William Barton Rogers himself in 1871, a document so obscure that only a handful of scientific colleagues had ever seen it. The memoir contained an appendix discussing the use of enslaved labor in American scientific work, and midway through these reflections, Rogers wrote candidly about a woman who had accompanied his 1847 expedition, describing her not merely as talented, but as possessing a rare intellectual brilliance he had found in only a few trained scientists in Europe. He noted her eidetic memory, her spatial reasoning, and her uncanny ability to retain entire geological formations after a single observation. Most strikingly, he described an encounter at the expedition's conclusion in which she thanked him in flawless Latin before walking away, leaving him stunned and haunted by the realization that she was a mind denied every avenue for advancement. Rogers explained that her knowledge had been acquired through illicit education from Colonel Hargrove's late wife, who had secretly taught several enslaved women to read and study from the Colonel's scientific library. When Hargrove discovered this, he sold off the others but retained this particular woman, recognizing the immense value of her expertise even while denying her the humanity that education implied. This revelation shattered Holloway's last remaining assumptions. The woman's genius had not been an accident. It had been cultivated, nurtured in defiance of law, and then weaponized by a society that simultaneously relied on and feared her intellect. Rogers's account also revealed the name he had recorded for her, Anna. It was not necessarily her true name, but it was the closest any surviving record came to identifying the woman behind the legend. Armed with this fragment, Holloway combed through post-war directories, business ledgers, and obscure newspaper notices, tracing faint imprints of a woman who seemed to appear and vanish across states with intentional precision. She found evidence of an A. Harrow, listed as a geological consultant in Philadelphia in 1892, a name likely chosen from her former owner's surname, perhaps to mask her past while reminding herself privately of the life she had escaped. Holloway began to understand that Anna had lived a life of extraordinary invisibility, carefully maintaining anonymity in a profession dominated entirely by white men. Had she openly claimed credit for her abilities, she would have risked not only ridicule but violence, especially in regions still steeped in resentment after the war. Yet behind this careful anonymity lay an unmistakable thread of intent, evident in the pattern of collapsed fortunes among those who had profited most from her enslavement. Her knowledge became both shield and sword, shaping the future of mining regions while avenging the past she had endured. But the most startling discovery Holloway encountered came from a source she had never expected, a descendant of Colonel Hargrove's estate executor who privately shared a long-held family secret. According to this descendant, the sealed letter that accompanied Anna at the Richmond Exchange, described as containing instructions for extracting knowledge, had not been written by the seller or estate executor, but by Anna herself. The executor had been forced to include it as a condition of the sale, and though he never understood her motives, he feared her intelligence enough to comply. The letter, he claimed, contained only 3 sentences. This woman possesses knowledge acquired through means that violated Virginia law. She will share that knowledge only if treated with respect and compensated fairly. Fail in either obligation, and you will learn that knowledge can destroy as surely as it can enrich. Holloway read this revelation with a chill, understanding at last that Anna had not been a passive victim sold at an outrageous price, but an active participant shaping the terms of her own exchange, exerting what little power she held in a system designed to crush every trace of autonomy. Her warning predicted precisely what would follow: Pritchard's rise and fall, the collapse of mining companies built on stolen expertise, and the ruin of men who believed they could extract value from her without consequence. Anna had engineered her survival with the same precision she applied to reading the earth. And as Holloway pieced together this truth, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of history, not as a record of powerful men shaping the world, but as a landscape silently carved by those denied power, whose brilliance remained hidden beneath the surface like the very minerals Anna spent her life revealing. Holloway realized her research no longer concerned a curious anomaly or a forgotten auction, but the story of a woman whose mind rewrote maps, redirected fortunes, and quietly dismantled the economic foundations built upon her enslavement. Anna had ceased to be merely a figure of mystery. She had become a force operating with patient intelligence across decades, her influence traceable only by those willing to look beneath the layers of silence that history so often imposes on women like her. Holloway spent the months that followed assembling her notes, convinced she had reached the final stretch of Anna's story. Yet one last unanswered question continued to gnaw at her. How had Anna's life ended, and what became of her after a lifetime of shaping the fortunes of others from the shadows? Driven by this lingering uncertainty, Holloway tracked the final traces of Anna's movements into the mid-1890s, piecing together a faint but unbroken trail stretching from Pennsylvania to New York, and finally to a small industrial town in Massachusetts. There she found a brief, easily overlooked mention in the ledger of a mining consultancy, an entry that listed A. Harrow as the instructor for a short-lived geological apprenticeship attended by young engineers in 1894. The handwriting, neat and deliberate, held a quiet confidence, as though the writer had finally reached a place where she could teach openly, if only for a short time. Holloway felt a jolt of recognition, sensing this was the closest Anna had ever come to claiming the authority she had long possessed. But the trail abruptly ended in 1895, with no obituary, no recorded death, no pension claim, no burial record under any of her known aliases. For a time, Holloway feared that Anna had been swallowed by the same historical silence that had obscured her early life. Then, in the autumn of 1893, while reviewing an unrelated box of documents at the Massachusetts Historical Society, she stumbled on a folded letter tucked inside a geological field map. The letter, unsigned and undated, described a woman who had worked briefly with a group of surveyors before departing suddenly, leaving behind only a small leather-bound notebook filled with sketches of ridge lines, fault patterns, and mineral seams drawn with astonishing accuracy. At the end of the letter, the unnamed writer added a final detail. The woman had spoken of returning to the mountains where she first learned to raid the earth, as though she intended to disappear completely into the landscapes that had shaped her. This poetic, almost cryptic line unsettled Holloway, for she realized it pointed back to Swift Run Gap, the very mountains where Anna had been exploited and where she had first demonstrated her genius. Missing the chance for certainty, Holloway nevertheless traveled to the Blue Ridge once more in 1893, carrying the faint hope that she might find some trace of Anna's final days. Guided again by Samuel Fletcher, she hiked through the overgrown paths to the old property, now even more reclaimed by nature. The cabin ruins had collapsed fully, the well shaft had filled with debris, and the excavation pits had softened into moss-covered hollows blending seamlessly with the mountain floor. Yet despite the wildness overtaking everything, Holloway sensed an unmistakable order beneath the chaos, as though the place itself had been arranged by someone who knew exactly how to leave no trace. Only when she wandered beyond the old cabin site did she find something that made her stop. A small cluster of stones arranged in a deliberate spiral pattern, half buried under fallen leaves. The configuration was too intentional to be natural, too restrained to be decorative, too unfamiliar to be any known surveyor's mark. Fletcher confessed he had never seen it before, and Holloway realized that the symbol was a signature of sorts, a quiet declaration from Anna herself, marking the spot where she had ended her journey, not as a victim, but as someone who chose her final ground. Holloway knelt beside the stones, touched by the simplicity of the gesture. There was no grave, no carved name, no inscribed testament. Yet the spiral spoke more clearly than any monument could. It represented the layers of the earth Anna had spent her life reading, the cycles of knowledge she had witnessed, the rise and collapse of fortunes shaped by her insight. It suggested a final return to the only place where she had ever been free to think, free to observe, free to exist outside the eyes of those who wished to control or exploit her mind. Holloway understood then that Anna had chosen her ending with the same precision she had applied to every step of her life. She had reclaimed her narrative by slipping beyond the reach of records, beyond the grasp of those who sought either to use or to understand her. Her final act was one of deliberate invisibility, not born from fear but from autonomy, return not to anonymity but to sovereignty. As Holloway rose and looked across the vast Blue Ridge horizon, she felt a profound stillness settle over her. The mountains stood unmoved, ancient and silent, and she realized they had always been Anna's true refuge, the only witnesses to her full brilliance. Holloway left the site with the certainty that the story she had uncovered was not merely about an enslaved woman with extraordinary knowledge, nor about the men who had tried to control her, nor even about the economic empires she had quietly shaped or dismantled. It was the story of a mind that defied the limits imposed upon it, a woman who navigated a world designed to erase her, yet who reshaped that world with a quiet, unstoppable intelligence. In the end, Anna's legacy did not lie in the ruined fortunes she left behind or the hidden maps she carried in her thoughts. It lay in the truth Holloway finally understood. Some brilliance is too vast to be contained in books or records, too powerful to be owned, and too deeply rooted in the earth to ever be erased. Anna had become, at last, part of the landscape she had always understood so completely, her story carried forward not by monuments or documents, but by the very mountains she chose as her final sanctuary.